The Abomination of Desolation, Exposing Jesuit Futurist Pastors. Correctly exegeting Luke chapter 21 verses 1 through 27, respecting pronouns and antecedents, and discussing Matthew 24, primarily verses 1 through 15. In this video, I'll start by exegeting Luke chapter 21 verses 1 through 27. It is important to understand that exegete means to draw meaning out of the actual text. After I have drawn meaning from the text, then I'll introduce correlation. Correlation is not exegesis. Rather, it is a part of Bible interpretation that involves comparing other similar exegeted scriptures to the ones you have just exegeted. Although exegesis and correlation are separate things, they work together. Since that distinction is not understood by false prophecy teachers, they jump to correlation before fully exegeting the passages they are working on. That typically involves them hopping over verses they don't like and ignoring basic rules of grammar that demand a plain reading of the text and contradict their presupposed doctrines. By doing this, they can proof text or find other verses that appear to support their false doctrines. It is important to recognize this, because sometimes what they say sounds good, but upon careful examination, many of their doctrines fall apart. Sloppy exegesis is something common among dispensationalists and futurists, who attempt to interpret prophecy to prove their presupposed pet doctrines, as their pet doctrines are usually more important to them than honestly and truthfully studying Scripture in context. They usually have an agenda, and it is beneficial for us to recognize their methods and techniques, and not fall victim to their mistaken conclusions. For example, I recently heard a pastor claiming to exegete Matthew 24, verses 1 through 15, when in fact he did little or no exegesis and avoided the obvious grammar of the text. He then skipped over all the verses from 5 through 14, where Jesus clearly establishes that the events described in those verses will be witnessed by the disciples. He went directly to verse 15, avoiding the pronoun ye, which makes it plain that the disciples will see the abomination of desolation. The verse says, quote, "When therefore ye shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." Unquote. Instead of quoting the verse verbatim, he paraphrased it, thereby avoiding the pronoun ye that contradicts his presupposed doctrine. His presupposed doctrine was that the abomination of desolation is about an end-time Antichrist, when the text clearly states that the disciples would witness the abomination of desolation. If that pastor had actually read verse 15 and the preceding verses verbatim, the pronoun ye would have unseated his false interpretation, as the antecedent to ye is the disciples. Contextually and grammatically, there is no other option. That kind of deceptive interpretation is typical of false prophecy teachers and common particularly among dispensationalists and futurists. Make no mistake, there will be a final Antichrist. But the verses that pastor claimed to exegete, Matthew 24 verses 1 through 15, have nothing to do with the period of time just before Jesus' second coming, nor do they refer to the man of sin and the son of perdition, found in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 3. The pastor had fallen into a Jesuit Futurism trap that gets the Pope of Rome off the Antichrist hot seat. And like all who are deceived by Jesuit Futurism, they waste their time speculating and playing pin the tail on Antichrist, as did the pastor in question. When I confronted him on his clever and intentional manipulation of Matthew 24, verses 1 through 15, and his avoidance of the pronoun ye, he became angry and accusatory and condescending. Rather than examining the scriptures and actually exegeting them, he went after me personally. Properly exegeting the verses in question would have proved his error, and he wasn't about to let that happen. Had he read the verses in their plain context, he would have had to acknowledge that Jesus was telling his disciples that they would see the abomination of desolation. It is so plain that even a first grader could tell us what those verses mean. Thus, in order to avoid falsely interpreting scriptures, we must try to draw as much meaning from the actual text itself, without speculation, before moving to other scriptures that may further support our conclusions. Despite this, it is still possible to make mistakes, so one must be open to the right kind of correction. This requires that someone who has actually exegeted the passages in question go through them verse by verse and methodically, in context, show you where you are in error. Dispensationalists, Futurists, and preterists can't do that, because that is not how they interpret Scripture. Their interpretive methods are heavily influenced by verse skipping, mentally changing words and obvious meanings, then mixing in opinion, inference, possibilities, probabilities, presuppositions, interpretive metaphors, and arguments from authority. True exegesis is certainly an inconvenience to their methods. Please turn to Luke chapter 21. In Luke chapter 21, it is important to first identify whom Jesus is talking to. Is it the disciples who will see the things Jesus prophesies? Or is it a future generation? For that, we need to begin with verse 45 of the previous chapter. It reads, "Then in the audience of all the people he said to the disciples." Thus we know Jesus is speaking to his disciples, primarily. For further confirmation of this, we need only reference a similar account in Matthew 24, where Matthew in the first verse of the chapter says that the disciples came to Jesus privately and asked him 3 questions. We'll look at Matthew 24 in more detail after we have gone through Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 27. Matthew 24 and Luke 21 contain messages given by Jesus, probably at different times. That would explain the discrepancy between Jesus answering the disciples with an audience present in Luke 20, verse 45, and Jesus answering the disciples privately in Matthew 24, verse 3. We must resolve the question, how can it be a private meeting if there is an audience? 2 separate accounts and 2 different authors would also explain additional information contained in one account, but not the other. In Luke 21, verse 7, the disciples ask Jesus, "Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass?" We know the disciples are first asking about the destruction of the temple mentioned in verse 5 and 6. They want to know when the temple will be destroyed. Verses 8 through 24 describe many things that will happen. With nearly every verse, Jesus insists that the disciples will live to see these things. For example, in verse 8, he says, "Take heed that ye be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them." And in verse 9, Jesus says, "When ye hear of rumors of wars," then verse 10 reads, "Then he said unto them," and verse after verse confirms grammatically that Jesus is talking directly to the disciples. This comes to a climax in verse 20, where Jesus says, "When ye shall see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh." Thus Jesus confirms that the disciples will see the destruction of Jerusalem and the desecration of the temple, the very same event prophesied by the prophet Daniel, as Jesus declares in Matthew 24, verse 15. Acknowledging that Jesus is addressing the disciples, not a future generation known as ye, is of vital importance, as many prophecy teachers will insist that none of the pronouns in those passages refer to the disciples. Yet the plain reading of the text demands we acknowledge that Jesus is talking to the disciples and means them to understand the things they will see in their lifetime. The reason false prophecy teachers hate the pronoun ye is they want the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple to be a future event just before Christ returns. These types of prophecy teachers are usually influenced by the dispensational interpretive method and/or its bed partner, Jesuit Futurism. Obviously, if they accepted the plain fact that Jesus is telling the disciples that they will witness the desolation of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, they can't say that the desolation in this passage happens during the time of a distant future Antichrist. False Bible prophecy teachers will often insist that if you take these verses at plain value, then you are a preterist. This is not true. Preterism is something entirely different, which I'll reference in this study and discuss more thoroughly in another video. From verses 21 to 24, Jesus warns the disciples that when they see armies encompassing Jerusalem, they should leave because the desolation is coming quickly. And then in verses 23 through 24, he describes the woes and distress that will fall upon those who do not heed his warning to leave. The first part of verse 24 describes the dispersion of the Jews into all nations, and the second part says Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. All these prophecies were fulfilled to a T in the lifetime of the disciples, though the time of the Gentiles is still ongoing, and it's the time period in which we currently live. Here's what we know historically. The Roman armies of Titus Vespasian encompassed Jerusalem in 70 AD, sacked the city, and desecrated and destroyed the Jewish temple, and that happened during the lifetime of the disciples. That is a fact that no one denies. After that, they dragged the Jews off to various parts of the Roman Empire. And to this very day, Jerusalem is being trodden under the feet of the Arabs and other non-Jews, Gentiles by any other name. Today, Jerusalem is considered an international city, not an exclusively Jewish city. This is further proof that we are still living in the times of the Gentiles, the end times. Please watch for the next part of our study, when we will correlate Luke 21 with Matthew 24. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to leave your comments and questions.